But here's the challenge when you're a leader. I used to call this the Saddam Hussein model of leadership, but everyone uses this. If you're a really narcissistic leader, when you're rising up the ranks, you're worried about competition within your own leadership. So if you have a number 2 person who's really good, you want to kill that person because they might be a threat to your leadership. Narcissistic traits are going to fit with more individualistic values. Narcissism is a bit of the dark side of individualism, where there's all these wonderful benefits of individualism, but the kind of one of the problems with individualism is you get run away on better than everybody else. Using ego as a major driver of social media. They built these networks. It wasn't like central planning. It was ego built them. And then people said, hey, this is so great. Let's use this for dating. It's just sometimes parents will, instead of focusing on themselves, will start to use their kids as tools for their ego. And that doesn't serve either the parent or the child in the long run.
Hi, Keith.
Hi, Tammy. How are you doing?
Nice to meet you. Good.
Nice to meet you as well.
Wow, this happened so fast. I was very impressed.
I love when you have a good tech team, and things actually work. And I love you've got some nice ocean waves behind you, which is some good vibes.
Yeah, they're not real though, unfortunately.
It's okay.
What's real these days anyway?
I know. It's a sort of AI ocean. No, I'm a big believer in real oceans. That's the one thing I think we need to keep is real oceans.
I agree. So I read your book, The New Science of Narcissism. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow. Thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah, that was very cool. I contacted Professor Twenge and she said, oh, no, you should talk to Keith. And then I was talking to Keith and then I had a new book to read. It was like, okay.
Well, Jean and I were postdocs for Roy Baumeister, who's a well-known social psychologist. And we had kind of a basement office at Cleveland, at Case Western, back in the 90s. So we've been friends for a long time. It's been a nice academic relationship.
And so have you been studying narcissism since then?
I have been studying narcissism, since graduate school. My dissertation was on narcissism and romantic relationships. Or romantic attraction was my dissertation. So I've been studying it, long time.
What started you on that path to narcissism?
Well, it's kind of, I've answered this and I never know what the truth is anymore, but I think part of it, like the nerd academic part, which I'm talking to you so I could go into a little bit, is that, as psychologists, especially in social personality psychology, we're always interested in how people self-enhance. They kind of tell these positive stories about themselves. Everyone thinks they're a little more attractive than they are. They think they work harder than they do. We just have this little bit of a bias built into us. And so I was interested in studying that bias. Turns out some people are more self-enhancing than others. Turns out some people really like to be the center of attention. They really like to be better than other people, and other people not so much. So I got into it for that theoretical reason of understanding self-enhancement and realizing why it's not everyone doing this. And then kind of more from the more personal side, I was always interested in Buddhism and Taoism and what the non-self was, sort of what is a non-self. And I could never figure that out when I was 20 years old. I still can't really figure it out, but I'm closer. But when you study narcissism, you can really study the self. So you're like, there's the ego, man. I can see it. I know how the ego works. I can understand it. I can work with it. So I became an expert on the ego in hopes of figuring out what the ego wasn't, which is a little backwards, but that's kind of how it ended up. So, and then the other thing is academically, you study, and if stuff works, you just keep doing it. And when I studied narcissism, it was sort of theoretical. And then there was the Columbine shooting. So we're like, well, let's look at narcissism and shooting. And then there was then people discovered selfies. And then there was social media. So during my whole academic career, narcissism has just exploded because the world has invited it in. So, I'm kind of like I would say I'm like the Ebola guy or something. I got lucky. We got into epidemic of my disease at the beginning of my career.
And I think, I was just talking, I was doing Pilates before this. I do Pilates online with a friend. She follows me around. She's done Pilates on a bus. She's done Pilates in the bathroom. Like, I've done Pilates everywhere with her. And I said I was going to be speaking to you and we were going to be speaking about narcissism. And she said, I hear that word all the time now. And it just is thrown around nonstop. And, I thought it's time that I had a really good look at ego through the research that you've done, talking about high extroversion, low agreeableness, and to see what it is, what it means, where it's going in our society, and how we can deal with it.
Yeah, that what you're saying is something I hear a lot. And so, when we first started studying narcissism and I talked to people, they didn't even know what the word was. And it was hard to pronounce. They'd say narcissism or narcissism. And there's historical reasons for that. It's been spelled different ways. And then, I kept talking to people, and now I hear the term everywhere, but people are using it as sort of a generic pejorative for jackass. So my ex-boyfriend's a narcissist. My prime minister is a narcissist. My president's a whoever. My father, my mother, and sometimes they are, and sometimes they're just kind of a jerk, but they're just a different kind of jerk. So there's lots of ways you can be a bad person, and sometimes they're not bad people. Sometimes you're jealous. And so you're calling them a narcissist because you're jealous because they actually are successful. So the term gets thrown around like crazy now. And, and there's some real big differences in how people are using it. So a big one is, are we talking about a personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, which is very rare, maybe 1 or 2% of the population, and it's clinically diagnosed? Or are we talking about a personality trait where we all have some narcissism, but maybe people have an extensive amount or an elevated amount of a normal trait? So that's one big distinction that people confuse. And then the other distinction.
And when you say traits, explain traits, because people might not know what that means.
Great question. So a personality trait is a sort of a tendency to act in a consistent way across time and across situations. So someone like me, who I am pretty high in a trait of extroversion, I'm sort of energetic, I'm outgoing, I'm assertive. If I'm on a podcast, I'm extroverted. If I'm hanging out with my kids, I'm extroverted. If I'm at a funeral, I'm a little less extroverted, but I'm still a little extroverted, So I'll change across situations, but I'm extroverted. And if you met me next year, I'm probably going to be extroverted. And if I'm not, you go, what's wrong, Keith? Did something happen to you? Did someone die? Are you depressed? So the idea of it is it's a way you behave consistently across time, but also across different situations. And what a personality disorder is when when your personality is sort of stable and extreme across time and situations, but you can't change it. So when you're sort of narcissistic on a podcast, everybody goes, that's how you're supposed to be. But when you do that with your kids are like, where's my dad? He's an arrogant jerk. And that's where it becomes a disorder. So if you can't really control your personality, it becomes fixed and it starts to wreak havoc on your life, your marriage, your work. Then it becomes a disorder. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
I went a real tangent there, Tammy. I'm not even sure where I am now.
That's all right. We can go wherever we need to go. That's the thing about a conversation. So I was really interested in your book. The first part of the book does a great job of explaining what the terms mean and explaining traits. And then there were different, and I don't, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know about all this stuff, but there's traits, and then there's different ways of categorizing them. And then it gets to politics. And when it got to leadership and incumbent leaders and leadership, that was very interesting that there, and what's interesting about what's going on in Canada right now, because we have a new leader, a conservative leader that is extroverted. He's extroverted and he's disagreeable. And he's been an attack dog in order to win the conservative leadership. But now he's the leader of the Conservative Party, and women don't like him very much. Yeah, he's got to turn into a statesman. He's got to turn into a statesman, and he's starting to wake up to that. But what does that mean for him? What kind of changes does that mean for him? It's awesome because in leadership, so when we talk about love and romantic relationships, narcissism is usually pretty toxic.
But in the world of leadership, you've got to have these big egos, because who wants to run the country? Well, it's the guy with the big ego, or the woman with the big ego. It's often a man. And they want to win. And so they go to war with each other. And when we have somebody on our side, even if they're narcissistic, they're extroverted, they're antagonistic, they're a strongman leader, they're a Trump or a Bolsonaro, or I'm trying to think the guy in Italy. But, there's a lot of these strongman leaders around. When that person's on our side, we're like, they're great. It's like having a great football player on your side, or rooting for a boxer. You're like, I want a tough leader to fight. But once they're leaders, you don't want a leader fighting. You want a leader leading. They're not supposed to be fighting. They're supposed to be leaders. So they need to transition from an attack dog into a statesman. They need to see somebody who can see both sides, who has some wisdom, who has some compassion, who can, doesn't have to be as reactive. That's a real transition, because we've talked about personality traits. These are how people are. People are wired this way, and they get reinforced for being who they are their whole life. And then someone says, now be somebody different. How can you do that? You can't. Yeah. It's hard. And so very rarely do you see leaders change. In the history of leaders is you get these strong leaders and someone has to take them out because they don't give up power. And in fact, I would say in our country, George Washington was seen as an amazing leader because he gave up power willingly. It was so unusual for someone to do that they would associate him with the Roman leader Cincinnatus, because he was the last leader anyone could think of, a couple thousand years earlier who would actually gave up power. It just doesn't happen with these big egos. They want power. They never want to give it up. So when people do, it's remarkable. It's another ramble, Tammy. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I'm wondering, because you can't change that, and because you've been this extroverted and antagonistic figure to get into power. Now you're in power and you think, oh, I'm the statesman now. You probably have to surround yourself with statesmen.
Yes.
In order to soften your approach, right?
Yes. So what you need, if you have a big ego, you need a team to kind of soften those edges. So maybe it's like, well, what Keith meant to say was that he appreciates your perspective, But here's the challenge when you're a leader. I used to call this the Saddam Hussein model of leadership, but everyone uses this. If you're a really narcissistic leader, when you're rising up the ranks, you're worried about competition within your own leadership. So if you have a number 2 person who's really good, you want to kill that person because they might be a threat to your leadership. So what these really narcissistic leaders do is they destroy the crop of young leaders around them. So when they finally get the shot, they don't have support and they get taken out. So narcissism, it can help you win, but it's also got the seeds of its own destruction built in, because you can't win really well without a team. You become isolated, paranoid, dangerous.
Right. Yeah. Well, getting rid of your competition, getting rid of the people around you who are going to be supportive and who are a little more agreeable, right? So they're the people who have some compassion. Yeah. Get rid of those people. Then you're in trouble once you're a statesman.
Yeah. So, I don't know the Russia, and there's so much propaganda. I'm not going to pretend I know any access to the truth. But when I hear on the news about Russian leaders falling out of windows, that to me suggests somebody in power is trying to shore up their strength of leadership internally. Yeah. So what happens is a narcissistic leader, you imagine in a company, Jack Welch at GE, to make it American, all his second and third tier of leadership ended up leaving everywhere else. And so he ends up being alone. That just happens with a lot of leadership is very, very hard.
So do you think that Steve Jobs was a good leader?
I think he was a bit of a trickster. And there's this wonderful cover from an old Wired magazine. They had Steve Jobs like a devil and an angel. And it's like, he's a Buddhist and he's mean to people and he loves everyone and he hates everyone. And he was a very complex figure. And Elon Musk is similar to that too. And figures like Musk, I look at as, archetypally, talking to you sort of in the Jungian sense, as trickster figures, where they have a lot of the narcissism and a lot of the ego, but they're often kind of mixing stuff up and doing jokes and trolling. And mythologically, those trickster figures have a lot of power, like in a lot of the mythology from the Southwest United States, the Native American mythology. Often the trickster, like a coyote figure, is a world builder. So you have these. This is a group of characters like Steve Jobs or Musk that do a lot of interesting things, and then sometimes you're like, God, that's the worst guy in the world, and sometimes you're like, that's the greatest guy on earth. They're interesting leaders, and there's not enough research on these trickster figures.
Right, because who knows what they're tricksters. Yeah, I've never heard of the personality traits of a trickster.
It's like it's a special form of narcissism because it's antagonistic.
There'd be some openness in there, right?
Yeah, because you're kind of playing around with things, you're moving with things, a lot of intelligence probably. But it's something that the academics haven't chased this down yet. It's just something I see in these interesting characters that have a lot of narcissism in them, but they're also very generative and creative. They're not just controllers. Right. They're not just power. They're kind of generative in an interesting way.
What about one more? What about Bill Gates? He's much more introverted, right?
Bill Gates, my take on Bill Gates is very sort of low on openness. He reads a lot, but he's not, I've never heard anyone think Bill Gates is an interesting or creative figure. He's more introverted. I've never met him, but when I talk to, this is when you study narcissism, you talk to a lot of workers. Like I talk to a lot of bartenders and staff and people who work in media just to figure out these characters because they know everything. And people generally, I've never heard a good thing said about Bill Gates from a bartender or a staff person or anything. He's not a really warm person, where other of these leaders are very warm. And he really likes power. So he seems more introverted and controlling and, but it's narcissistic, but it's not in the classic grandiose way where he's got a great suit and looks good and you like him. Like he's not very likable. He's just got a ton of power. And I'm not a big fan of sexual predators. So it's a very closed off kind of power. Vulnerable narcissism.
Who would someone that was a vulnerable, who would that be?
Yeah. So, just to take a step back, because I should have run through this a little bit with grandiose narcissism, it's this sort of, I'm important. I have a sense of entitlement. I'm better than you, but I'm also driven, I'm ambitious, and I'm looking for opportunities to shine. So I'm not so much defensive as I'm offensive. So, it's the World Economic Forum and I'm Bill Gates. I'm like, here's a chance for me to speak to people. This is my time to kind of, even though he's more introverted, he's still kind of not as defensive. You look at more vulnerable and this is why in politics we see a lot of grandiosity or in relationships. The vulnerable narcissism is much more about defensiveness. It's much more like I'm better than people, but I'm a little introverted, I'm a little neurotic, and I don't want people to know how bad I am. So I don't say much. When someone criticizes me, I get angry. Maybe I say something online about them. Maybe I do something indirect to get back at them, but I don't want to confront them exactly. And so what these vulnerable narcissists look like is sort of defensive, neurotic, not really likable, people interested in power. And often it's harder to see at first. And that's why they would often call this covert narcissism, because you go to a psychotherapist because if you're, I'm sad, no one respects me. And they think, oh, Keith, you must be depressed. And then you start talking to Keith, and you're like, wait a second, Keith, you're depressed. And you think you should be Bill Gates, but you don't actually leave your house. Like, dude, if you want to be Bill Gates, go be Bill Gates and succeed or fail, but don't just have a fantasy and get on the internet and make fun of people.
So do you think that the trolls on Twitter have a vulnerable narcissism?
Well, the data on trolls, from what we have, you do see narcissism and you do see some grandiosity, but you see that the biggest signal is sadism. So it's primarily that, like, I like to be mean and hurt people. So there's actually like certain people enjoy causing suffering. And that's not kind of classically narcissistic. Narcissism is classic, like, I want people to think I'm a big deal. Sadism is like, I like to hurt people. And so with trolling, you see sadism. And where I think you'd see the vulnerable narcissism more is, the anonymity. So I can go out there and be aggressive like I'm a big dog, but I'm protected. Whereas in the real world, if I want to go be an alpha dude, well, the other alpha dudes kind of beat me down. And so
what about Antifa? Because they mask themselves, right? They get out there, they're looking for trouble, but they're masked. They won't show themselves.
Yeah. So what I think is going on, and with all this stuff, Tammy, I have to say, like, I would love to spend 2 weeks with really smart people and dig through data and not just speculate like I'm doing. But what we're seeing now is, the classic narcissism is look at me, I want power, and you celebrity, pay attention to me, leader. But when you see this more collective action, like collective violence or collective action, it's not as much look at me, it's like look at us. So it's a little more of this communal narcissism element. I'm doing this, I'm going out there to take you out and implement my view of the world on you to make it better for everybody. And it's not about me, it's about us. So it's narcissistic, but it's less self-focused. And I think there's more vulnerability in it. I think if you took an average Antifa member and an average celebrity, I don't know, the average football player, the difference in neuroticism would be the Antifa would be higher. So it's like group-based narcissism, but you're protected because you're hiding behind a mask and you're part of a group. You see this with a lot of collective stuff. Collective action is a narcissistic quality, but it's not individual. It's like group narcissism.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about, it's such a good book. Oh, the Dark Triad. So the Dark Triad has sadism in it, right? That's sadism that.
Yeah, they actually made it a dark tetrad to add sadism. It's the dark triad. So there's a psychologist, Del Paulus, up at British Columbia, good dude. He's a Georgia grad back in the day, and he started getting interested in these antagonistic traits. And what he sort of discovered or got interested in was this commonality between traits like narcissism, which is what we're talking about, and psychopathy, which is a little more, it's like narcissism, but maybe a little less self-control, maybe a little more about, getting people and not so much about look at me. And then Machiavellianism, which is a term we use for maybe manipulativeness. So the term Machiavellianism comes from The Prince by Machiavelli. And the way I describe it to people, it's always the advisor to the throne on a show like Game of Thrones. There's always people in there that are like trying to figure out all the secret plans. That's more Machiavellian. So those three make up the Dark Triad. What they share at the core is a high level of trait antagonism or sense of entitlement. There's a core selfishness in there. Another trait they've added more lately is sadism. And sadism, as I mentioned, is this idea of like you like to cause pain to people. In the earliest studies, they had people take, this is wonderful. I'm getting excited about this research and it's so evil, I apologize, but this is just what happens. They had people pretend they were killing like sow bugs or pill bugs, those little bugs under rocks, and grinding them up in a coffee grinder. And some people like doing that. And you're like, ugh, that's sadism. Like, I like to cause pain. And it's not that common. Most people don't like causing pain. Most people don't like hurting people at all. It's hard to make them hurt people, but some people don't. So so you put those together and you end up with the dark tetrad.
I think I heard about that that study, and they said that the bugs actually weren't ground up, that they made the noise. That's so sneaky. That's so sneaky.
Yeah, we try, the old social psych, it was a lot of, PT Bart, we do a lot of fake stuff and, it was fun. It was fun.
Yes, sure. The other side of sadism, so the Hexaco, which is the sixth trait of the Big Five.
Yes.
Loosely?
Yeah, so that the Big Five divides the world into 5 traits and the Hexaco puts it into 6. And what the Hexaco allows you to do is it pulls out a trait called honesty, humility, which is a lot like narcissism. So that trait really gets pulled out in the Hexaco model.
What do you think the relationship is between the honesty, humility trait and sadism? Are they opposite?
They will be, they would be negatively correlated.
Yeah.
And I I don't know. I don't know how strong it would be versus maybe the other piece of antagonism in the model. I don't know, but definitely that they're going in the same direction. People who are sadistic think they're better than other people, generally.
Yeah. Right. And humility is that you don't think you're better than other people, right? So it's opposite.
Yeah, but humility is really interesting because there's kind of the class, there's a different ways to be humble, and there's sort of the selflessness way, like I've transcended myself and I'm just, like I people say so much negative stuff about, I kind of get used to it. I have a little bit of humility I've just earned over time. There's also humility where you're like, you don't like yourself. So it's sort of I'm not great, I'm terrible, where it's almost like a self-centered humility, like Dostoevsky and notes.
Self-pity. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost like my ego. And you're like, dude, you're not that important. You're not it's this like Dostoevsky, like Notes from the Underground. Like, dude, you're not the worst person in the world. You're just a dude like the rest of us. We're just trying to do our best, and maybe you got some work to do. So you can have this kind of more toxic humility, I think, too. But generally, I like to think of humility as a much more beneficial way of looking at the world, but just less ego interfering and distorting your vision.
So when they developed the Big Five, how long ago did they develop that?
That is
a question.
Well, I don't think there's a specific answer, because when you look at the history, they popped up in maybe the 30s. They popped up at Big Five, and then they kind of let it go and went for a 16, and then there's a 3, and then they come back to a 5 again. So there's a bit of a history. And it was people trying to figure out how to settle in. And the other thing is people were coming at what we're trying to do as personality psychologists is we're trying to build a general personality model. So, hey, Keith, I need a general map of how the psychology works. And so personality psychologists are like, let's make a really good map. And like any map, you can make it super detailed, but it won't really be useful because it's too complicated. So you want to simplify it. So there's an effort over time to sort of simplify the traits. Do we want 5, 10, 16, whatever? And we kind of settled on 5 over time. Some people went and looked at natural language. So they said, well, if we have these personality traits that are in language, let's look at that. Other people looked at personality scales, and people kind of came at it different ways, and we converged on it. But I don't think it was any point. It was just discovered. It was more like a convention that we've agreed on over time. Nothing's magic. These are just maps we use, and you can switch. I could switch my Big Five map with my Jungian map, and they're both good maps. And
so is it well accepted then in the personality domain that the Big Five is looked upon as a good thing to describe a personality?
100%. The field has converged on Big Five is your primary general personality model. That said, there's lots of interest in what's outside the Big Five. Maybe interests are different than the Big Five. Maybe other things. There's a lot of, like looking at narcissism, looking at these really deep antagonism traits. There's interest in people looking at more pathological edges of the Big Five. So maybe we can do a Big Five that's more pathological. There's other people that are still into maybe a Big Six, other people into a Big Two. So there's a lot going on at the fringes, but we've all kind of agreed is like, hey, this is where we're going to kind of meet. And whatever we do, we're going to relate to that, and then we can relate it to something else. I mean, personality science works really well. It's a very good science because we have these very good quantitative tools that we can all refer to.
Are there any discussions of how to bring values into the personality traits?
So that's a real interesting issue. Different people have tried to come up with value scales. So there's different sort of variants of values. And often what you'll see is the level of values will be mirrored in personality. There'll be a connection between them. So values of individualism or power or autonomy or freedom are going to be more linked to narcissism. Individual, values that are more caregiving or sometimes more like spiritual values might not be linked to narcissism. So there's going to be an association between values, and where narcissistic values or narcissistic traits are going to fit with more individualistic values. So sometimes I think of narcissism as a bit of the dark side of individualism, where there's all these wonderful benefits of individualism, but the kind of one of the problems with individualism is you get run away on better than everybody else, and you start to, ego takes control.
Yeah, well, I think as I get older, it seems to me that that making sure that your values are organized in your personality is definitely something that makes every day better.
Yeah, I 100% agree. The metaphor I use are those Chinese or the Russian nesting dolls. I used to, I go to Russia, you get the dolls, like a little doll with a bigger doll. We used to call them like babushka dolls or grandma. There's a name for them. I don't know. And I describe people like that sometimes. I say, look, you want your life to line up. Well, you need to start with your physical basis. You need to get that to line. I'm a yogi. You do Pilates, but you got to do something, whatever it is to make your body work. And then you got to get your emotions to work. You got to be calm. That's the meditation. That's the grounding. That's the self-talk. And then you've got to get your mind right. You got to learn to think, and you've got to get your personality correct. So you're not running off the rails all the time. So you're conscientious enough. You're not crazy. You're open. Like for me, my openness always gets me into trouble. I got to pull myself back all the time. And then you kind of line up your values with that. So I'm a creative, open person. I value that in the world. That means I want a world that values freedom, independence, creativity, maybe trust and respect for each other because we're in a creative environment. So that's my value system. And then my relationships would match onto that. So you're trying to build the whole system. So it all, so all the energies, and then your spirituality should, it all should flower. It's the lotus.
Right.
Sorry, I just reinvented the lotus. I apologize. I thought that was pretty smart until I realized I just stole it. But I think that model to me is try to line these things up is just a better way to be because you're going to have less conflict. And
so if you're dealing with a narcissist then, and you're trying to help them to come to a better place, somebody who's like going towards the disorder end of narcissism, so they need help, their relationships are suffering or their work is suffering. How do you go about that?
Yeah, so it's a challenge because people who are narcissistic, and like this, I wrote a book on this, so it's not just one mistake, but probably at the core of it is you put yourself over other people. So you're in a marriage and you're like, yeah, I'm not picking up the kids because I got to go get my hair done. And sorry, you just have to do that. Or, you're at work and you don't help people and you always go out and do sales and talk about yourself. So you're selfish. And people don't like that. So they say, I want, Keith to change. He's too selfish. So what they say is don't be a narcissist. Well, that doesn't work because you go, I'm not a narcissist. I'm the top producing salesman at this company and you suck. And so that doesn't work. So what I suggest is look at a person. Narcissism is a great label for me. I'm a psychologist. I like to study this stuff, but to understand a person, what is it specifically that's the problem? You don't need to label a person, but you say, you know what, truth is, I like the fact that you get dressed up and I like the fact that you're good at sales. I just wish you cared more about your kids. So let's really focus on this one specific behavior where you could be even more effective. So try to frame things in terms of how this behavior isn't taking away from you and giving to me. It's how I'm making you better because I'm making you a better father. And good fathers love their kids. Look at John over there. His kids love him. Don't you want to be like John? Everyone respects John. And so you're trying to have them reshape the story so that their ego is aligned with the spiritual and financial and psychological well-being of their family and community. That's the challenge.
So let me see. So that seems to sound like it's a positive trait to be caring and to take care of your kids. Yeah. And what they're doing is something of self-importance usually. But if they could have also some importance for other people,
yes,
and be a part of that, that could be a good thing, right, for them.
Yes, and it's a way of reframing it. So if I see somebody, all they care about is looking good, and I want them to do something, what I do is say that what I try to do is align the thing I want them to do with their looking good. So if I have a leader, and if I want my university president to talk to the faculty more, I'm like, God, those great presidents always do listening tours. wouldn't it be great if you did one too? Because then you'd be the best. I mean, you're already the best, but you'd be the best. Like, oh, I'll go do a listening tour. I mean, it's very easy to manipulate narcissists if you know what you're doing, because you just need to feed them breadcrumbs and I find it. So I don't get bothered as much by narcissism by people because I find it pretty easy to work with, but I'm also a different person. And I'm also not in a marriage or in a power relationship. And if you're in a power relationship with somebody narcissistic, a boss, a husband, a wife, it can be awful. Like I don't want to undersell how horrific these relationships and how abusive they can be at the extremes, because they are truly awful and horrific.
How about online narcissism? How do you think we should deal with that?
So,
and I know you've written about that.
For 20 years. I mean, it's just, it's been like 15 years or something since, 13 years since the first paper on narcissism and Facebook. So what happened when we made the online world is they said, hey, you can go make a personal webpage. This is before social media. You can take a personal webpage. You can take a picture of yourself with a camera and put it on your Facebook, on your MySpace page. You can do all these things. Well, who did those things? Well, the people who really jumped at the chance were more narcissistic. And again, when I first said this and people started giving me death threats, they're like, you're saying everyone on Facebook's a narcissist. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that people who jump at the opportunity to get their image out to the world tend to be a little narcissistic. It's not everybody. It's like if I had a bar, ladies' night at the bar, what guys want to come? A lot of guys are going to come. But I'm going to get a little more narcissist. You know what I mean? It's like I'm selecting and I'm just pulling my selection, and that's what I'm selecting for. And when you look at the data of social media and you look across this, and this is meta-analytic work, what you find are narcissists, grandiose narcissists on social media have more friends, they have more followers, they have more connections, it's easier for them, it's easier to take selfies. So what in social media world is a world about lots of shallow relationships. So what we did was we created sort of the perfect savanna for narcissism. Like, hey, narcissist, where do you want to thrive? Hey, how about I want a site where I can show people pictures of myself, and then people can say I'm awesome, but not say I'm bad, and I can put people down and then make friends with people with high status. Perfect. And then, so we made this narcissism, and then they sold it to people. It's like, it's going to make everybody hug. And they're like, the Dalai Lama is going to hug Satan or something. And I remember seeing this. I'm like, do you know anything about social psychology? You network everybody, they're going to turn into two groups and kill each other. That's just people. People do that. You got to work. No, they didn't. I mean, so we built this entire thing using ego as a major driver of social media. They built these networks. It wasn't like central planning. It was ego built them. And then people said, hey, this is so great. Let's use this for dating. These apps have been so great for forming relationships. Maybe we should use the same strategy for dating. And it's been an utter disaster as far as I can tell.
I never thought of that. Oh, yeah.
It's a freaking disaster.
Narcissists dating narcissists.
Well, you start using dating apps, and you get the exact same ratios as you get with Twitter or Facebook. You get more followers with more narcissism. You get people more comfortable putting out content. People make fun of guys. They're like, why do guys have all these pictures holding fish? They just make fun of men for this. And I remember one time somebody asked me for a picture of myself, and I looked at and I had one picture of myself holding a fish. Because I don't take pictures of myself. What kind of freak goes around taking pictures? You only take a picture to have a fish or a buck, And so you have a world where people make fun of guys because they have pictures with fish. Like, dude, what kind of idiot takes pictures of themselves? I like to go fishing. So the dating world is designed for narcissism. That's who does. I mean, the online dating world is great for that, and it's great for people who are instrumental, who use people like numbers, who play things algorithmically. It's materialistic and algorithmic, and
that's fascinating.
Wouldn't call it healthy.
I never thought of it that way. No. So maybe that's why when you meet somebody online and you finally meet them face to face, you don't get along.
It's really hard, right? I mean, you can form great relationships online. There's so much wonderful things with it too. But but there's so much space for ego. And it's really, so in a lot of these forums, you get ego being, it's like you're selecting for narcissism. Hey, here's whoever wants to show up and shoot their mouth out about themselves and self-promote is who we want. Well, you're going to get a lot of narcissism. You get a lot of other things too. A lot of people are creative and they just like to talk because they think it's cool to tell stories. A lot of people they like friends. They just like conversation. There's a lot of reasons people are social. Narcissism's one of them.
And you wrote about narcissism and relationships. And when someone has a mother who's narcissistic or a mate who's narcissistic, you were saying how terrible that is and can be if it's a narcissistic personality disorder. So it's a deep narcissism. Do they just have to get out of that relationship? Is that how it has to? Do they just have to stop that relationship? They have to they need good boundaries. Is that what it is? Maybe they need good boundaries.
You're talking about a parent. You're talking about more about parenting or romantic relationships?
Parenting or mates.
Okay.
Both.
So I think so. It's really important to set strong boundaries. And if it's a bad relationship, I don't give advice to people anymore, but if it were my daughter, I'd say, just get out, if you've got a real toxic relationship, but if it's your parent, you can't, you just, cause you can't get out. Here's what I hear from, there's not as much research on parenting and it's starting to happen, but it's just harder to get the data. Here's the story you hear with the narcissistic parent. With the kid, sometimes a child becomes a prop for the parent. So I'm a narcissistic parent. I have an attractive daughter who's good at gymnastics. Well, I drive around the country going, look at my daughter, how great she is, and check me out. And the back of my truck is like, I'm a winner at gymnastics. And so I use my daughter for my own self-esteem. My daughter thinks my dad loves me because we have this relationship as long as she is performing. She hits age 15 and she starts to fall apart a little bit because she starts hitting this normal adolescent conflict. And she goes, Dad's going to support me. Dad doesn't support her at all because he doesn't love her. He loves the idea that he's got a gymnast daughter, but he doesn't know her at all. And she starts to realize her whole life is like a movie set. She thought she was in the Old West, but it's really just props. And it's a really... I've talked to people, and this isn't data, this is me talking to people, that transition where you go, oh my God, my childhood was a movie set. And then you have a sibling who wasn't a star. And they go, dude, I told you the whole time. That's why I've been drunk since I was 13, because Dad's a maniac, and he just liked you because you were good. And then, people end up, it's like, it's kind of like you've been gaslit for 20 years or 15 years, and you kind of wake up from it. So it can be a real challenge, but it's not as simple as it's just bad. Sometimes it seems good and it's bad, which is almost worse than just having an abusive parent. It's more complicated, and and working through these relationships, because a lot of times, these kind of narcissistic figures can be really interesting figures too. They do a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. They're successful. They got good and bad. They got energy, and it's a really hard thing for people to work out. Really hard.
So these days, with the scientific surgical methods that we're using now and the hormonal changes that we're making to children and parents, really, I've seen some online. I don't have one, in particular that I'm thinking of, but I've seen mothers particularly parading their children and saying that, now they were born a girl, but they're a boy, and how wonderful that is. And then they're in the spotlight, because that's the spotlight that is being shone upon right now. And so, this is a very terrible thing. I believe it's a very terrible thing, and it sounds like a narcissistic. It sounds like a narcissistic situation to me, but I'm not certain that that's true.
Yeah, whenever you're in the medical field, in the medical world, and there's a possibility of getting attention from a sick child or a child who needs treatment, that is an opportunity for people who are mentally ill to jump in. So we talk about this clinically as Munchausen's by proxy. So Munchausen syndrome is sort of pretending you're ill to get treatment. Munchausen's by proxy is pretending my child's ill to get treatment so I can get sort of attention and maybe some affection. So that's always been a risk in medicine, is that people will seek treatment for reasons that aren't necessarily medical. They might have some secondary interest. And we also have a whole field of plastic surgery, which is people seeking medical treatment for social reasons. And very comfortable. There's a lot of narcissism and selfies, and I talk about that whole world. So what you're concerned about is when you have issues going on with children's psychological health, that this potentially, and I want to be real clear about this because we're on a podcast, potentially is an avenue for people to seek narcissistic or other kind of emotional needs through their children.
Yes.
The same way you put a sticker on your car that says, my kid is the honor student, and that makes me awesome. And again, nothing wrong with that. If your kid's an honor student, great job, parents. It's just sometimes parents will, instead of focusing on themselves, will start to use their kids as tools for their ego. And that doesn't serve either the parent or the child in the long run.
Right. And I think that that's something that we have to be aware of. When we have children, we have to be aware of living our own life, taking care of them when they're young, giving them independence as they grow up, and letting them be who they're going to be.
It is, as speaking,
keeping our mitts off them.
Yeah, speaking as a parent, it's so hard because theoretically, young dude Keith, I'm like, well, that's going to be easy it's easy when I say it. But when you get there and your kid's making a decision, you go, I would make that decision, and you don't want them to suffer, and you're trying to control them to stop them from suffering. It's hard, and you have to step back and go, this is the process, but my own fear is going to interfere with their ability to mature. It's a struggle.
Now, the other thing I was thinking of with young kids, instead of saying in the morning, go get dressed, and then they don't get dressed, and you wonder why they're not getting dressed. But if you go in there and you say, do you want to wear the pink dress or the yellow dress? Then they can make a decision. And the same thing when kids are eating dinner, right? When they're eating dinner, it's like, eat your dinner. Well, do you want to eat the carrots or the potatoes? Right? So, and simplifying it for them. And so I've been just reading about it and then paying attention and wondering whether we are creating narcissists by telling a small child, what do you want to do today? We can do anything you want, dear. Or I'm busy, but I'll stop work and I'll do whatever you want. And, this kind of creation of a narcissist.
Tammy, I'm laughing that you're saying this because Jean Twenge, you wrote a book back in the day called, I think it was Generation Me. And she had an example of a child being given a bunch of choices by her father and how that could create narcissism. And why are you giving your child choices? Well, that father was me. I was the one. So I'm occasionally in books, under pseudonyms, but that was one of mine. And I've thought about it a lot from that day. And I've talked to Jean about this, and I don't give parenting advice. And like I said, once I've got my life locked down, I'll tell you guys what to do. And that should be in about 10 or 20 years. But mostly when with parenting, you realize that a huge amount of it, the kids are turned out as genetic. And you just don't need to worry about it because they're kind of wired a certain way, and that's how they are. And just deal with what you have. And then the second thing is love them. Just be loving, because that core foundation of love or early attachment. And if you have people love you and let you kind of express yourself, within the degrees that you're not getting hurt or hurting people, you're going to turn out okay. And if you start going, I'm going to shape my kid into me because then my kid will be successful. I'm going to make him not me because I was such a screw up, and I'm going to make him successful. It doesn't work. I wish it did, man. I wish I could tell people hey, this is the secret. You can program your kids like drones. They'll kill you. They hate you. You try to turn them into you, they just won't do it. You can't do it. You can break them. And so better is
I mean,
like,
we can't even make ourselves do anything.
that's what I said, dude.
We don't go to the gym like we tell ourselves to.
No, and I like, if I got the best psychiatrist in New York to try to fix me, I couldn't do it. So how could I do it to my child? It just doesn't work. But I can love my child, and I can accept how they are, and also accept that they're the way they are because they got some of me in them or their mom in them or whatever. And I can try to work with that like a complex system, and I can be very comfortable that if I have 2 kids, those are going to be very different children because they have different genetics, and it's not me. It's just they're going to be different, and I'm going to parent them differently because they're different. So I have 2 kids. One is incredibly conscientious, and when she was young, I remember saying, "Look, if you did something wrong, I will punish you. But if I'm not punishing you, you don't need to punish you." That was our conversations. Right. I don't think I punished her. I've never punished her whole life. My younger daughter, she never listened to anything I said. So if I punished her, it didn't work. I'd be like, "Don't do it." She's like, "I hate you, Dad. I'm still doing it." Didn't work either way. Just and
with my son, we couldn't punish him either. We could reward him.
Yeah,
we could reward him.
Yes,
but we couldn't punish him.
Right, because somebody who's high in reward sensitivity, high in extroversion, they're going to work with reward. Somebody like me who's more neurotic works with punishment. So I'm trying to use my system. It didn't work at all. And so you have to use a different system. And so anyhow, I think the important thing as a parent is meet your kids where they are and kind of take your ego out of it as much as you can and just say, look, my job here is to be a loving parent and give them a space to grow and keep them safe and fed and loved. It's a real challenge. I'm not sitting here going like, yeah, I'd do it. And you guys, good luck. It's a struggle. It's a struggle.
No, it's a struggle. I have 2 kids too, and they're 30 and 29. And I try not to beat myself up for all the mistakes I made, and just love them and trust them that they can find their way. Right.
But you're doing that at 29 and 30, and I'm doing it at 20 and 15. It's the same struggle. And then the beating myself up, which I do all the time. This is my yoga. I'm like, you're not supposed to be mean to other people, and that includes you.
That's
so it's
right,
like,
because that's you today and tomorrow and the next week. Yes.
So be nice to yourself. Parent, no one teaches you how. We don't even know how if we could. And reality changes. So this is what I find with academics. People go like, Keith, how do I have a career? I'm like, dude, I could tell you out of a killer career in the 80s or the 90s. I nailed the 90s.
Right
now, I'm as clueless as you are. I don't know how to do anything. So culture changes, reality changes. It's very, very hard to tell people what to do. But if you just go, look, I'm going to be there and be present and be loving and stuff's good. And listen. Yeah, God, that's so hard.
Listen. That's a skill.
Yeah,
that's a skill worth developing.
Yeah,
I've never been a great listener, but I'm doing my best to try to listen. Well, the podcast is good training, right? I have to listen, so it's very good training for me. I have to listen, or I can't ask a question.
Well, you notice me. I'm the star of the show, and I'm jumping out of my chair over here to try to talk. That's how screwed up I am. Like I go to conferences, and I'm like,
that's a good guest. That's a good guest.
It's a good guest. It's just like, but if you're talking with people about ideas, I'll talk with people, and I'll just bury them. With other academics, I'm like, I got to just shut up and just be calm and let people speak and relax. And,
my sister, she's a palliative care nurse, and she would have meetings, and she'd have meetings with people, and there would be certain people in the room who'd talk. And then there'd be other people who didn't. And she called them the 1-beat people. Those were the people who would respond right away when she asked a question. And then there were the 2-beat people. And so at the end of the meeting, she said she had to go around and ask each of them if they had anything to say, because the 2-beat people would have been thinking the whole time and not saying anything.
But that is very smart, because what happens in all personality selection is that extroverts are overrepresented. So when I have a class, the extroverts, I think, are the smart ones. When we pick leaders, the person who says, I want to lead, becomes the leader. And so extroverts are always overrepresented. And if you want the truth, you need to make an effort to get to the more introverted people. So that's great. That's great advice. Great advice.
Yeah. And Jordan, in his classes, he said he used to make groups out of his students, and he'd put extroverts with extroverts and introverts with introverts. So then the introverts within the introvert group, there would be the most extroverted person, but everybody would be more likely to speak.
Yes.
And that's a cool idea too.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I like it too. Well,
so I'm just thinking about how to do that in my class, but I have 300 kids and I'm like, well, if I did that, it would work. Maybe I should. Anyway, sorry. Yeah. It's cool stuff.
50 kids per group, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a lot of kids.
It would be a lot of kids, but I've done those type of things before, and it's very interesting. One of the real lessons you learn in personality science is that people are different. And that sounds obvious when I say it, but for a lot of my life, I thought people were like me. And people are very different from me, and they want different things. And the things I think everybody would want, a lot of people don't like those things. That's true for everybody.
Right. Yeah, that's true for everybody. And I find too, I'm learning as I get older, that if I listen and wait for an opportunity to show itself rather than imposing myself on people, it goes a lot better. And I don't think that was what I learned at home. I don't think that I learned it growing up. I've learned it later in reading a lot about self-reflection and finding out what my motivations are, and just waiting if my motivations are emotional, if I'm all wound up about something, to just leave it, to just leave it until I calm down, until I can find a better way, a kinder way, a way that won't be offensive. Yeah. Right. And so we have a very reactive society.
Yes.
And who knows what these phones have to do with that, but you have constant information coming your way if you want it. You can decide that too, but we do choose to have constant information coming all the time. Right.
And what travels on networks are things that are emotionally charged, negative. That's what travels. So if the Twitter's a giant brain, the signal that's being sent around is usually something negative, toxic, hostile. It's like what we watch on TV, bleeds, it leads. So that's how we're kind of just rewiring ourselves in this constant state of fear and anxiety. Because that's just how it works. It's not like we send puppy pictures and love all the time. It's negative threat signals.
I was sick for quite a while, about 3, maybe 4 years ago now. And afterwards, I couldn't watch anything upsetting because I'd been too sick, right?
Yeah.
And so I think on Instagram, I put on good news.
Good filter.
I put on National Geographic. I put these are the kind of things that would scroll through now.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't. I think I went and I watched a movie this week. For the first time, it was a kind of a dark humor horror type movie called Megan. It's a kind of a Chucky movie.
Oh, the kids were talking about that.
And I did it. I sat in it, and I was okay with it. And so I'm getting back to being a normal kind of person who can put up with these negative things. But our society is steeped in. It's jarring. Right?
Yes,
it's jarring.
It's not healthy, and I'm a big believer in trying to unplug and come back if you can get some time to get off the grid. It's been harder with the pandemic to get away because I would always go up to Canada, and they shut me down. So, but I think it's really good to get away from it and come back because it is the messaging right now is very negative. It's very toxic. There's a lot of conflict. I mean, we're very politicized. It's just not a fun time. And so, and all those messages hurt you. And so being smart like you are, being sort of intentional about what you feed yourself with and putting in some positive stuff, I think is really good. Yeah. It's really good wisdom for people. I need to do it more myself.
Well, I need to do it more myself too. But it's something to think about anyway, right?
It's a practice, yeah.
Yeah, it's a practice. It's a practice, which is also something we could talk about for quite a while. But I think we've talked about this, and I really appreciate you coming on. You're lots of fun to talk to.
Oh, thank you. That was really fun. Love these conversations.
And I just hope that everybody can find something in it that they can take away with them.
Absolutely.